Hey friends, today we are going to be continuing the Roald Dahl Twits from the Funny Walking Stick. Let's get started. The Funny Walking Stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took a walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small, the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't even notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it is happening. You yourself, for example, are growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was also slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even if it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling that there was something wrong with it, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "That's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must have suddenly grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it?" "Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're a shrinking woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible." "Oh, yes, it jolly well is. You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never," she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are, you're sitting at your old chair, and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he had been with the walking stick. Every night he had gone downstairs and stuck an extra little bit on the stick. He had done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you. You're sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've just shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble, but Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens when you get the shrinks," he said. "What? What happens?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "Your head shrinks into your neck. Your neck shrinks into your body. Your body shrinks into your legs. and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except for a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes. I can't bear it, cried Mrs. Twit. It's a terrible disease, said Mr. Twit, the worst in the world. How long have I got? Cried Mrs. Twit. How long before I finish up in a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes? Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. At the rate you're going, he said, shaking his head sadly. I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. But isn't there anything we can do? Cried Mrs. Twit. There's only one cure for the shrinks, said Mr. Twit. Tell me, she cried, or tell me quickly. I'll have to hurry, said Mr. Twit. I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say, cried Mrs. Twit. You won't last long if you don't, said Mr. Twit. What is it I must do? Cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. You've got to be stretched. Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for this great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He fixed an iron ring on the ground. Stand here, he said, pointing to the iron ring. Then he tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it filled up with gas, it pulled on its string. Trying to go up and up, Mr. Twit tied the ends of the string to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, some to her wrists, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. Can you feel them stretching you? Asked Mr. Twit. I can. They're stretching me like mad. Put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloon, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days, nights, to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened a big mouth and said something silly. Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground? She gasped. If those strings are on my ankles break, it would be goodbye for me. And that's what gave Mr. Twit a second nasty idea. That's enough to pull me, take me to the moon, Mrs. Twit cried out. To take you to the moon? Exclaimed Mr. Twit. What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything to happen. Oh dear me, no. We most certainly wouldn't, cried Mrs. Twit. Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe. Very well, my angel, said Mr. Twit, and with a girlish grin on his lips, he knelt at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash he cut the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. Help! She screamed. Save me! But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below. What a pretty sight, he said to himself. How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. What a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone. That's it for today, friends. We'll continue with Mrs. Twit Goes Ballooning Down tomorrow. Bye!